record right now. I think it's recording. So I want to say thank you to Lilith for taking the time. We've been looking forward for this. I have met her few times. And my name is Carlos Siqueira. I'm the leader of the Salesforce Architect Group in Tampa, Florida. I have been a Salesforce MVP 5 times from 2017 to 2021. And right now I work as a product evangelist. I'm on the market. Let me put my 5 minutes or 5 seconds in there. But the event today is about architecture, about what Lilith wants to share, the gaps in there. So with that said, Lilith, take it away. And once again, thank you so much for being that kind and generous to spend your time like really late in the night. So folks on the call, we should really appreciate her efforts. Take it away, Lilith.
Thank you so much for having me and for joining me. It's quite late, so I'll try to be as proficient as I can.
Take your
I did
time.
have some energy drinks with me just in case, so
It is 3 o'clock somewhere else, maybe in California. It is 3 o'clock. So
Yes, it is.
Okay, so let me see. I can share my screen. You should be able to see it. Okay, let me check because it might be the first time that I'm doing this. Sorry. Okay, I might need to rejoin. I'll be there in a moment, okay? I'm sorry about this.
We can blame it on the temperature.
Okay, so I'll try again. This time I think it will work. You should be able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. I'm sorry about that. Macs and their settings are sometimes a bit fickle. So what I want to talk about today is the gap. And that is the gap that usually when you are on a project, you encounter as an architect that you see there is something that business wants. You have a lot of business stakeholders. You have a lot of IT stakeholders. So what is your role as an architect? Usually it's actually just to be that bridge and make sure that, you can balance the perspectives of these two groups of stakeholders. So that is what I want to talk about a bit more today. But before I do, I think it's only the polite thing to introduce myself a bit more. So I'm Lilith Van Biesen. I'm a trailhead fanatic. I really, really, really love to study. There's actually a mistake on this slide because I'm 24 times certified now. I got in a bit of a sprint end of last month. So one of the certifications is the CTA exam. I'm also a SIMA group co-leader. So if you haven't checked out SIMA, it's a really cool group. It's for aspiring architects, likely like yourself, or established architects as well. And what we do is we have a similar approach to what Carlos is doing here. We're trying to bring people together, have interesting conversations, interesting topics. So, check us out. We also have a YouTube channel where we publish our recordings. I also work as principal architect at Capgemini, and I'm an amateur zookeeper of 2 dogs and 2 cats. So that keeps me quite busy. If you want to interact with me, always feel free to reach out via Twitter, LinkedIn, Trailhead. Usually I respond the quickest via LinkedIn. I sometimes forget to check the others, so don't be mad if I don't respond immediately. I will see it and I will give you an answer. Okay, so when we're on a project, and just in general, I think I'm a bit of an optimist in that sense. I think people really care, but sometimes the priorities or the way that they look at a problem is really different. So, for example, when you're on a project, you see that you have the business stakeholders. They really know the use case. They know the users, their needs. They can bring in those subject matter experts to dive even deeper into what are the processes, what is the knowledge that we need to introduce, what are the elements that they need, and how can we best support them. They can also really help in evaluating that room for change. We're all working with Salesforce. We know that there are some standard ways of doing things. We also know that they don't work for everyone. But this assessment of, okay, can we go standard as much as possible, or do we need to deviate here or there, is something that business is really very capable at making that assessment with you. So that is something that I think is always very good to keep in mind, that they can be your ally on that. And then they will also need to help you assess whether, the processes are really stable and unified. Because in some situations you may think, okay, this is how they work, and you set up a system based on that, but then it seems that actually their way of working is quite fickle, or it changes, or there's some regional variations. So these are the things that you want to know up front, because they have a big impact. And there again, collaborating with business can make it a lot easier to make sure that you're all on the same page, you're working in the right direction. So that's the background of the business stakeholders. When we look at the IT stakeholders, well, they know the technical possibilities. They are experts in their field. They can really evaluate what is the implementation and maintainability efforts of a particular design that you may have in mind. They also will, of course, try to follow best practices, which, again, going back to the out of the box thing, means, can we do it with the standards? Can we try to stick to those? So it might sometimes be a bit tricky to communicate why it's not always the best option from business point of view to really go with these standards. But it's really important to communicate and emphasize that, so that you're all on the same page. And they can, of course, really assess the stability of the system, going back to this out of the box. If you don't want to go that way for a particular reason, you might go more complex, then it's very important to keep in mind that this will have an impact. If it is a process that is not as stable, not as unified, then it will affect the stability of the system as well, because you'll need to do a lot of changes, which goes again into the implementation and maintainability efforts. So we have two really big groups of stakeholders. Both have such valuable knowledge and information, but there's some difference here and there in the perspective and the value. So business, being a bit more, generalizing on this, but usually they value the ease of use, the flexibility of a system, and quick throughput of improvement. So they want to be able to really react fast. If they see that something needs to be changed in the process, they want to handle this fast, because this can have an impact on how competitive they can be compared to competitors, or just how quickly they can introduce new market trends into their processes. Or maybe it's even a bigger stake at a bigger value at stake. For example, it can really just impact adoption. Maybe there's a particular aspect of the process that is holding people back from really using the system. And then that is something, of course, that they want to handle quickly, because it's very, very tough to keep people motivated in and working in a system. You have to constantly monitor and make sure that you have everyone on board, because otherwise some shadow systems will start to occur, a spreadsheet there, a Word document there. You don't want that, so you need to make sure that you have them on board, and your business stakeholders have that. In Dutch they say finger on the pulse, like they really know what's going on. So you want to leverage that strength and allow them to make improvements and drive improvements. On the other hand, you also have the IT perspective, and they want to have the ease of maintenance, because again, if something needs to change, needs to be updated, if we not want to make sure that the system keeps working, we want to make sure it's easy to maintain. We want to make sure that it's scalable as well, and that any improvements that we do are done in a qualitative way, which, as we will come to a bit later, is always going to be a balance. So these are our main actors, our main personas, let's say, that we will talk through in this session today, and who you, of course, know very well throughout your projects already. So, but you are all architects, and architects take the lead. So we have a few different types of leadership. I stole this from one of the Salesforce Trailhead modules. I highly recommend, because I think, they have very, very good content for architects. And this is one about the B2B customer relationships. So you have the business leadership. I already introduced it a bit. They know the needs and wants. Compliance, I think, is also a very important one. We'll touch a bit more on this later anyway. But they have also the vision. They know what they want. They know why they're going in a certain direction. And the more that you know the vision as well, the better you can support it. And the better you can also translate this value, this need, and this overarching concept to the other stakeholders. We have the delivery leadership, who is, of course, responsible for the people, the processes, the product, making sure that whatever we put out is valuable, is adopted, and is, in some way useful, and following or supporting the processes in mind. And then we have, of course, the technical leadership, also already introduced, who have the knowledge, the experience, and will handle the actual implementation. So I try to narrow it down into 7 reflections, 7 things that I think, if you keep them in mind, they can really be kind of the guidelines to balancing these perspectives of different stakeholders. And why 7? Well, it's a catchy number, so it might be easier to remember than 11. So starting with the first one, I always like to think from a user point of view. I think it is vital in making sure that whatever you're providing as a solution will make sense in their processes and therefore will be used. And there's a lot of different factors here that will play into, what will your solution actually be used. So one could be, what type of user are you dealing with? Are these internal people, or your sales, service, marketing, let's say? Are they external? Are they customers? Are they partners, suppliers? What is their role, and how often do they use a system? If we're talking internal, I'm guessing is very, very frequent. But even there, sometimes you see, one of the projects that I had, they used to have a system where actually their salespeople use the system quite often, or they were supposed to, but we saw that they usually use it mostly on Fridays, because then they kind of like took all the information that they gathered over the week and just put it into the system. So that was an indication for us that, okay, so why are they doing this? Well, this was because Friday they were always in the office. So we improved the system to be more mobile friendly, and then this, made sure that actually the frequency changed a bit. They were more empowered to actually enter the data in a more frequent way, which made it a lot easier to collaborate as well, because otherwise your whole collaboration is actually, again, not happening necessarily in the system. You're working on outdated information, likely for at least, let's say, a week. So it's really important to keep this in mind. And it's also going to affect how you're going to implement certain processes. For example, are you going to make sure that you have a very, very intuitive process flow? We always want that, but again, if we want to go very intuitive, we might not be leaning as much to the out of the box capabilities as much as we could, because working with Salesforce, even though I think it's a very intuitive system, it requires a bit of training. It requires a bit of knowing, okay, what are accounts exactly? What are contacts? What are opportunities? What is the difference between an opportunity and an order? What is a renewal of an opportunity? These are some trained procedures that, are feasible to train within internal users, but they don't really, you can't really do it that easily, for example, for external users. So maybe for partners you can, because they're a limited number. You maybe have some trainings that you do with them already. So that might be easier to accomplish. Well, yeah, you're not going to train your customer how to use your system. Your system needs to make enough sense for them to use it. If not, they are just going to look elsewhere. So that you have certain room in some domains there, but not everywhere. And this will, of course, affect, for example, which UI options you're going to choose. So again, if it's for external users, you might want to go with something a bit more custom or more flexible than the standard page layouts, just because you want to make sure that they don't give up on the system, that they don't find it too difficult to understand. So you'll make a choice. And then the question is, what is that long-term implication going to be? So, for example, the implementation may have there will be a difference in the implementation. Page layout will take a lot less time. The quality assurance will take a lot less time than when you're going with, for example, Lightning Web Component. Same for maintenance, and in some cases also licenses. For example, if you're going to go with an Omni Studio solution, you're going to need a different type of license in some cases than you would, for again a page layout. And then the required skill set is it's a Lightning Web Component. You're going to need some developer skill set. Is it Omni Studio? Well, you're going to need someone who has experience with that as well. Is it a flow? We know that admins are moving with lightning speed, let's say, towards flow, but still, there's a lot of things that are a bit new there. So maybe you need a crash course for your admin on that as well. So these are some of the general considerations that I think, as an architect, you need to keep in mind. And then going back to the different perspectives from a business point of view, we will need to get the input again on who are these users that we're dealing with. Are they sales, service, marketing, partner, supplier, customer? Because this will influence how often they will be using the system. For example, let's say sales, they may live in Salesforce. This may be their go-to, especially if it has, for example, document generation incorporated, their emailing incorporated as well. It can be really like their unified system, which would be great. But in some other cases, for example, let's say marketing, it might not be fully the same way because, of course, yes, you have a lot of awesome marketing automation, but maybe you need to create some graphics outside of it, or maybe you need to do some advanced workshops, brainstorms or whatever, which will not just take place in Salesforce. Could be, it really depends. And for your partners, maybe they are indeed really users, your suppliers. Well, do they really need access? It's a lot of things to keep in mind, and these will frame the solution that you bring and how you translate this back to your IT stakeholders as well. So another aspect from business is, are they front office or back office, for example? Because again, it makes a difference in how they're using the system. The time crunch they might be on, how they are interacting with the customer. This is, for example, like a synchronous interaction, maybe a call center. They really have the person on the phone, so they can't really just say, okay, I'm going on my lunch break. I'll check it out when I get back. It has to happen now. Everything has to happen very, very quickly because you know how you've been, or I know how I've been when I'm on the phone with a call center. I don't want to spend hours on there. I just want to get my issue or whatever I'm calling for fixed as soon as possible. So anything that we can do to make it more efficient is going to make a huge difference for this particular user. While in some cases it's more async. Maybe the order fulfillment doesn't have to be quite as, real time. Everything doesn't need to happen now and instantly, but it's better to maybe have a review process on some of those aspects. So again, it really will affect how your user is going to use the system and what solution that you're choosing. And then going back to the solution part, maybe your IT would say, okay, we can use in-app guidance, we can use my trailhead, but again, it depends on who is using the system. And this is again why it's really important that the two communicate, because my trailhead is really, really powerful if you're working with internal users. But if you're using, or if you're trying to create a system for your customers, you can't really just say, okay, if you want to learn how to work with our website, you have to go to this e-learning platform. Yeah. Very likely they're not going to do it unless your platform has some magical elements that they really, really need. Otherwise, they're just going to go to an easier website to use. And then again, are you going to go with the page layout, the dynamic form, for example? All these things were some of the UI options that I mentioned, with each one of them having a different impact when it comes to implementation, maintenance, licenses, and required skill sets. So again, it's really important to have this background, have it back and forth, take some of the knowledge that you have from IT or that your IT experts bring you. For example, let's say you have a particular UI that you have in mind, and actually there are some existing components that you can reuse to very easily and quickly create a Lightning Web Component without starting from scratch. You can basically recycle 80% and, have a UI done there quite quickly. Well, maybe if you have that information, you will choose a different solution than what you would have done if you would have started a Lightning Web Component from scratch. So these are some of the things to keep in mind, because they have a huge impact. And that's why talking to both of these groups of stakeholders is really important, and making sure that you communicate the value and the point of view of one back to the other. Why are we so hesitant on going with a custom UI? Well, this is why. We know, we have our IT stakeholders. We know why the maintenance will be heavier, why each release update will be a bit more scary, and why any change you want to do later on will have a bigger impact, bigger effort as well. Being able to communicate that back will make a difference. And again, it will make sure that actually everyone is on the same page. They know, they share this thought, they share these values, and they can communicate it back. Because in the end, for example, your business stakeholders, the people that you're working with, are likely not the full population of users that you have. You have some key users, and they will communicate it forward. So if you have them, in the right mindset and able to understand what are some of the considerations that we had when we were designing this, they can also, reflect that in the communication that they have. And again, it can lead to better adoption, which I think in the end is what we all want. Then I really love this one. So not every technical problem has a technical solution or needs to have a technical solution. So this was something actually that resonated most with me during my journey to CTA. So Vinay Sail, who is an awesome CTA, he kind of emphasized this to me so much. And I think it's such a good point of view to have, because sometimes, especially when we're coming more from this technical background, doesn't have to be developer, can be admin too, but we sometimes think, yeah, we can solve this problem, doesn't matter, we'll make it, we'll get it done. But we really need to reflect a bit further on, does it really need to have a technical solution? How often does this problem or challenge occur? Does the effort that you're willing to invest, or that you should invest to actually provide a solution, a technical solution for this, is it justifiable based on how often this is occurring? This is why in some cases, maybe a swivel chair, for example, integration is sufficient, and you don't want to go with, platform event and this whole chain of systems involved, because it just happens so rarely that the effort that you need to put in to actually maintain this solution will be higher than what you're saving business from doing. So is it really worth it? And this is a very important thing to keep in mind. How often does it happen? And if we were to think out this technical solution, what would be the complexity and the reliability and scalability of such a solution? I have an example later on which really illustrates this, but that is really important to keep in mind. If you have a very complex technical solution to fix a particular problem, you always have to assess, one, can it be simpler? And if it cannot, do we really want to build this monster? Because it's going to be a lot of work to maintain. And business might not even really love it as much. So is it justifiable? And then when we think about this particular solution, how will the happy and unhappy paths of this solution impact business processes? So happy path, well, I assume that the technical solution would have a huge advantage. Otherwise, why are we even considering this? But what about the unhappy path? What if something goes wrong somewhere? What is the impact then? So I'll dive into this a bit more with the example. I think it's the easiest way to illustrate it. But with business, what we want to really discuss here is, what is the as is versus the to be? And, what is the return on investment of this complex implementation? Again, if it's just an integration or information that needs to flow from one system to another 3 times per year, do you really want to set up an integration for this that you need to maintain as well. If it's just 3 times per year, you have to really think about, does this really make sense? And then from an IT point of view, what is the reliability of the solution? So this can depend on the data model, but also on the device, the API. There are a lot of factors that can play into why a solution may not be as robust, may not be as reliable, and may fail in certain situations. So if that has a high probability of failing, we don't want that, because any failure of the system has an impact on the sense of credibility that the system has with the users, and we don't want that because this can affect adoption. So again, keep this in mind. And if we need to do some error handling, debugging, and maintenance on the system, how much effort is it going to take? So let's make it a bit more concrete by an example. So I wrote this little user story. As a field technician, I want to easily set the right customer location for an asset during installation. So interventions for asset malfunctions can be directed to the right location. So just to make it very clear, I'm a field technician, I'm installing an asset. And when I'm installing it, I need to make sure that it's attached to the right customer location, so that later on, if we get some events, let's say from the asset indicating, okay, it seems that it's about to malfunction, or it's not working as it should, that we know where our field technician needs to go to fix that. That's the need. Now let's look at some options. We have option 1, which is a full automation, really all bells and whistles, where you're going to use a GPS location on a mobile app to automatically select the right customer location when you're installing the asset. So as you can guess, this has a lot of working parts that go together. GPS location likely is going to be the Google Maps API or something like that, so that we're going to rely on. Your mobile app, again, which kind of device, how precise is a GPS of that particular mobile app? We've all seen it, especially if you're kind of nerdy like me and you were into Pokemon Go at some point, that when you were walking, your location just kind of like jumped all over the place. You don't want that to happen in this particular case, because if you're in a densely populated area, as Belgium is, then your customer location might be picked up incorrectly. Maybe you're linking it to someone else's customer location just because of some malfunction and impreciseness, let's say, of the data that you're selecting. So some of the tricky parts of option 1. Option 2, partial automation. So okay, we are actually allowing the user to select the right location, but maybe we're helping them. Maybe we are showing a map with the customer locations nearby, so that it's easier for them. They don't have to scroll through an entire list. Or maybe we're just going off of the fact that they're in a work order. They're likely going through some steps anyway, so we already know which customer location they're at. There are some different ways that we can do this, depending, of course, on the bigger scope and context that I didn't provide here. But as you may sense already, my preference in this case would not be to go with a fully technical solution of actually determining for the user where they are, just because there might be something going wrong. And going back, if you look at previous slide, so what is the unhappy path here? Well, I already described it a bit. One of the unhappy paths could be that it's actually linked to the wrong customer location. In that way, you're not getting really an error as the user, but your data is incorrect, which might be even worse because you have no idea that something is wrong. But you will see that really when the asset starts to malfunction, there might be a call going out from our service team to the customer to indicate, hey, we noticed that asset XYZ is going, rogue. It's really showing very weird meter readings. So we would like to send someone to fix it. Can we come, somewhere next week? If this is not their asset because it got linked to the wrong location for some reason, it's really going to be a very unhappy or a very odd conversation for them to have, and it doesn't really build trust, because of course they feel like you don't know them that well. You're thinking this particular asset is linked to them while it's not. So the impact that an unhappy path could have here is a very big one that you don't want to face. Well, if you look at what time do you save, yes, you do save time, of course, but on the other hand, does it justify the mess that you would potentially need to clean up if something goes wrong? In my opinion, no. I would feel much more comfortable with the second option here, which is the less technical solution, that just, make sure we're not calling the wrong customer. Your solutions need to make sense end to end. So this seems very like kicking in an open door, but you would be surprised. So especially because sometimes you're just thinking along with the customer, you might be too much in the, either the business or in the IT frame of mind, and you're not linking the two together. And that's where the key to this particular guidance is really, are your data flows complete? So for example, you may have a scenario which fully makes sense from business point of view. You're walking into a particular situation. Let's say there's an order that needs to be sent to an external system, and it makes sense until you actually go through this, and then you see that, okay, so we're sending the order to the ERP, for example, but it doesn't have the customer information. Are we going to create this order in a vacuum? We're not, of course we're not. But then we need to actually know which customer is linked to that. So how are we going to sync that? Everything needs to make sense. It needs to play in as a whole. And there again, it's making sure that you're balancing the information that you're getting from business and the information that you're getting from IT, and making sure that you're going back and forth and getting everyone every piece of information they need and asking the right questions. Another part in this end-to-end is, for example, when you're working with external users, they will be created at some point. So when and where and how are they created? For example, let's say if you feel that it makes sense once the order has been paid, or maybe even sooner in the cycle, doesn't really matter, but at some point you feel like, okay, now they should actually get access to the portal so that they can monitor how, what is the progress of their order, when will it arrive, and those kind of things. So maybe you want to create the user automatically when this DML happens in your system. Fair enough, but we know licenses cost money, and we know that if you exceed your number of licenses, then this is not going to work anymore. If this is an automated process, it's not going to work anymore. So how do you keep that from happening? Well, again, by really thinking together with business, with IT, to get all the information, to see the full picture, and to then in the end make sure everything works end to end. So from business, you will need who works where with which information. For your data flows, for example, right? You need to know, where is a certain record going to be created? What information do we capture there? And what is relevant where? So what is your system of record going to be? And which data needs to be synced? Is there possibility that certain data, certain fields, let's say, are being updated into systems? Let's take a very specific example of an account, a customer, where you have a VAT number. So it might be created, the account might be created by your sales in Salesforce, but then actually it could be that it's going to be correcting, or your back office is going to be correcting the VAT number in their ERP system based on the information that they're receiving. Could be. In that case, that's a tricky one, because then you have a two-way sync of this information, and you need to define what happens in case of conflict. What happens if you're trying to sync, and maybe within a very close, a very small time frame, this particular field was updated both in Salesforce and in the ERP system. Which one is the master? Which one is going to be kept? What is going to be, the field or the value that survives? This is really important for IT, but it's also a process element that needs to be discussed with business. And then, when should something become available? So we're talking about, for example, this order. Traditionally, you're going to send indeed an order to an external system for fulfillment, but then when should that happen? Is it needed that it happens in real time? Can it be near real time? Can it even be like scheduled? These are things that will play a role in the integration pattern, the tooling that you'll use. For example, how complex is the system landscape? Do we need a middleware solution? Once we're going enterprise scale, likely we'll need this. If so, what are the capabilities? Do they support event architecture? Maybe you have a very old middleware still there that doesn't really work that way, so it needs to have a different kind of tooling mechanism to actually be integrated with. Which other parties are involved? Taking a different example, ERP is quite straightforward because usually there's only, it's quite easy or quite understandable where it needs to end up. But maybe you're working with a more complex system. Maybe, for example, you need to send information to different government systems, for example, right? Because maybe you're validating that someone has a driver's license, or maybe you're validating that a VAT number is valid. Just a few ideas, and then you need to some kind of orchestration. Well, again, can your tooling do that? What are the capabilities? Which are the different parties that you're interacting with? If we're working with governance systems, we know not all of them might have an API available for this. Maybe you have to have a manual process that is kind of like your fail-safe in case they don't have this. So these are all the things that you need to keep in mind, and they will have, again, an impact on your processes. You need to have people know what to do in case the government system isn't integrated and they need to do this manually. Do they need to call somewhere? They need to have the information, and they need to have the ability to do this exercise in the system. So you need to have a hybrid solution in some way that allows you to actually update fields that would otherwise be updated through integration, which is always very scary to allow people to do that, because then, in some cases, they might override actually what is coming in via integration. So you need to set up additional validations. So you can see how this can become very complex very quickly, but it's really important to go down certain rabbit holes just because you want to go there first and not discover this later on. And then I always want to know what legal and compliance has to say about anything that has to do with data and data flows, because maybe we actually can't just send certain information or request certain information from a governance system. Maybe you are not allowed to require certain information from our customers. We don't have a legal basis to do so. So this is always very important. And again, maybe it's not always correct to bring compliance under business, because businesses are not always compliant. So you have to really make sure that in line with legal and compliance, then bring them in. Request that these guys take a look at what you're doing to make sure that into those. I don't know if you've seen the GDPR fines, but they're very scary. I don't think your customer will be very happy to pay them. So it's just better to make your life easier and don't go in that direction. And then a final thing from the IT point of view is when we're talking about this user creation, for example. So how are we supporting this? If they are creating, are we going to also allow them to use third-party providers, identity providers, such as, I don't know, Google is a very traditional one. So there's quite a few things that have an impact from a technical point of view, but they also might have an impact from a governance or a business point of view. So again, in this case, if you're automatically creating users, you need to have a monitoring system for your licenses as well. You don't want to just find out that you've run out of licenses, or at the very least, you want to have a process in mind that keeps track of users who haven't logged in recently, so you can deactivate them. You need to think through the entire life cycle, so you need to make sure everything works end to end. And that's a lot, but that's why you have your IT team to support you and to think along with you, and then your business team to help you make certain decisions on okay, we are okay with creating users automatically, but we want to get an alert if this or that happens, if we're this close to running out of licenses, for example, or we want to have a dedicated person who is monitoring this, who is in touch with procurement, who can actually acquire additional licenses if it needs to be done. Again, whatever makes sense for the company that you're working for, but you need to have something in place. And then I'm fairly sure everyone knows that you make assumptions while you're talking to a customer, right? While you're reading an RFP, anything you're doing, you're making assumptions all the time. I think it's human nature to want to fill in the blanks. But are you aware of the ones that you're making? Because these are really, really important in project work, and especially as an architect. The assumptions that you're making are the points that you need to validate with the customer. So these are kind of like the questions that you need to ask. So that's why it's really important to be aware of which assumptions that you're making, so that you don't just assume something without double checking it, because that will be, you will run into some very unpleasant situations in that case. So you need these assumptions so that you know what information and who do you need to get to the right solution, and what factors, for example, will play into acquiring or decommissioning certain systems, especially if you're going into, for example, a brownfield, or a situation where you may have a more complex system landscape, and maybe they're not necessarily knowing already what they want to keep or decommission from their systems. Is really important to know, okay, if we're going to decommission this particular system, is there anything there that well, we can't really provide out of the box in Salesforce, for example? And what is the process behind this? Who is using this? What is their attitude towards the solution? If you're going from a solution that was built especially for them, where they had a huge stake in creating any process that was in there, and anything that they dreamt of was just added because it was custom development, then yeah, you have to really make sure you get them on board early. So you need to know what factors play in there. You need to know from business, what are their goals? So again, for example, are they going to walk away from these systems? Maybe now they're just decommissioning two, but in the end they want to really move 5 to 10 systems to Salesforce, and you'll need to have a broader group of people involved in certain discussions to make sure whatever you're building will be scalable for the other systems in the future scope as well. What are the current frustrations? These could be things that, really either help you in transitioning to a different system, or they may be really, kind of allergies that you need to steer away from. Maybe the users don't feel heard, then you want to make sure that you definitely involve them. So these again are some of the things that you don't know yet, you need business to help you with. And what are the non-negotiables? So we'll jump into this a bit later, but there's always a non-negotiable. Very, very rarely have I seen business completely open to changing their entire system to whatever you think makes sense. They know, what they're doing. They have a particular vision in mind. So, there usually is one thing they just don't want to change. And then from IT point of view, again, the system I mentioned is everything that we're, stepping away from, something we can provide in Salesforce. And then that is also what kind of you have to keep in mind in what I'm talking about in Moscow in terms of system features. Let's say your current system has very, very extensive offline capabilities that maybe you're not really able to provide to the same extent in Salesforce. So how important are they? You need to know, just so that you don't run into a situation where this is a non-negotiable from business, that now you're kind of trapped into maybe going with a very complex solution just because it isn't within the realm of Salesforce standard capabilities. And then again, what is the as is? What is it to be with regard to features and landscape? Again, going into that we already know that they're going to decommission 3 systems, but actually they want to decommission 10. We need to know, what long-term to be is as well. So I always like to say being an architect is just often asking the right questions. So why ask questions? Well, you want to know the context. Who is, is doing what and why and where and when. Not the best sentence I've made all night, but you want to know who is really using the system in which situation. So that's your when and your where. What are they doing there? And very important is why are they doing this? Because this all will have an impact on how you're going to design the system. You want to know what is the as is, and then I added this 5 whys because it's a particular methodology. Just make sure that you really drill down into why are they doing things in this way right now, and make sure you don't take, that you're not pleased when they just say just because we're doing it right now in that way, that's why we're doing it. There has to be a better reason why they're doing certain things. Is it more efficient that way? Of course, yes, everyone knows this way of working already. It has an impact on your training if you're really stepping far away from that. So it is something to keep in mind, but we do want to know really why are they doing things in this way right now. Is this because that was how the previous system came with their standard processes? If that's the reason, then well, might not be good enough to really stick to those. And then for the to be, evaluate your room for change in the process. So these are again the non-negotiables that I was talking about. Is there room to change this process, or is this actually a non-negotiable? Is there something that needs to be done because maybe your company is a Belgian company and it has to adhere to all kinds of tricky regulations when it comes to languages, for example. So when you're printing a document, it has to be in all the 3 languages of this country by default, just because there's some silly little law that says you have to do it that way, for example, right? So that is some non-negotiables that you just have to adhere to and really need to incorporate in that case. So always good to have business there to be your sparring partner, to know how far can we go, will this fly? We rather want to know earlier sooner than later, just to make sure that we're not building anything that won't work in the end. And then that leads us to the risks, of course. If you're tackling things early on and identifying and raising risks, it doesn't necessarily make you a Debbie Downer. I think it's a very good quality to have. I like to think of myself as an optimistic pessimist or something. I like to think, what is the worst possible outcome? Just so that okay, how would I prepare for that? What is the worst thing that could happen, and how is there anything I can do to mitigate that? And I feel that that just saves me a lot of time stressing later on. Of course, I stress way more in advance, so is it good in the end? I don't know. It's my nature. I am afraid I can't really change it too much, but I do think it holds really a lot of value in a project, because in the end, if you've raised the risk, you've at least already have someone think about it, have a shared responsibility, and that's what you need to do. If you're proposing a certain decision, you want to know what is the long-term impact, what are certain risks that could come from this. Will this be a maintainable solution? Again, going back to the licenses, is it going to be scalable? If we are really growing out a lot, will this spiral out of control? Will we run out of licenses, and what will happen then? Will it have an impact on our business? How are we going to tackle that? And also, again, the flexibility. Going back to one of the earlier points, where we want to make sure that the system that or the process that business is using, we know how stable it is. We know how the regionality plays in a role, how many variations does need to have. These things, this level of flexibility that is needed, is what you need to know to assess whether your solution will hold, or will it actually be a risky one in the future? And another one is, for example, these dependencies. What are some of the dependencies that you may have to work with? For example, integrations. If you're going with a certain pattern where you're sending or defining the fields that need to be sent and received in two systems, then okay, that's going to be a dependency every time you change a field or something, you add a field and it needs to be added to an integration. You need to change it in two places, for example, or these are some things that you need to keep in mind just so that it's taken care of when you're actually planning a project, when you're actually going through everything. It needs to be accounted for. You can't just say, for example, in typical sprint mode, you're going to pick this story up if there's a dependencies attached, because we need to make sure that everyone else is aligned so that we're not pushing something that will break production. That's the worst thing that could happen. But if we were to break production, what needs to be communicated when and to whom? We have to have a plan, just in case. We never want to, actually face these risks. But if we do, we need to know what we need to do so we're not just all running around screaming, panicking. We need to have a plan. And one of those things will involve identifying with business what are, for example, the business critical processes. By doing that, then going back to the IT side, we can, for example, set up particular regression testing to make sure that whatever change we're doing, that these business critical processes are automatically regression tested, and that we know these will still work. That could be one way to make sure we're mitigating any risks. Another thing that I really like is the probability and impact matrix. So how likely is it that this risk is going to happen, and how big is the impact? So this is something that is really important, so that you're stressing about the right things. If something is very, very unlikely to happen and will have a very low impact, now maybe we don't need to stress about it that much, because if it were to happen, it's not going to be the end of the world. So these are just things to keep in mind to make sure that you're focusing on the right thing and that you have a structured approach to these risks. From an IT side, there's so many cool tools that you can use, from prevention and monitoring, quality gates, regression testing, and of course error handling. But in the end, a lot of it boils down to the ownership. Who is going to do certain things? For example, integration again is a classic one. Something goes wrong somewhere in the integration. Well, let's say there are at least 3 systems involved. The system initiating the integration. Maybe there's a system facilitating the integration, middleware, and then there's a target system. The one where we're actually trying to reach. So if an integration fails, where is it failing really? Who needs to look into what? Well, likely is going to start with the integration initiating system. But then if they don't really get a hold of, then the team responsible for the middleware, and everyone is just kind of like, shoving the responsibility back to one another, we're not going to solve anything. So we need to make sure that everyone takes ownership. Whatever happens, integration is a shared responsibility. So if something goes wrong and someone from the other team needs you, you need to jump on it and make sure that you answer them, give them the feedback that they need, and do some digging in your debug logs of your own to make sure that we can get this solved as soon as possible. So that's what I mean with the ownership. Then there will always be a point where something needs to give. So I was talking about this earlier, about maybe business wants particular thing, they're not really ready to change their mind on something. There's a few factors that we need to keep in mind. There's standard ways that we want to do this. There's this whole ideal situation that we have, and sometimes we just will not be able to keep that going. Sometimes something will need to give. We have these 4 parameters or elements that I think are kind of like the pillars of project management. You have scope, schedule, quality, and budget. So if any of those changes, it will have an impact on the others. And that's what you keep in mind. That's what, business also needs to realize. And I'm a bit biased in this one because I'm very, very, very hesitant to make any compromises when it comes to quality, just because I'm sure it will bite us in the ass later on. But it could be. So be wary of quick and dirty. My husband likes to say there's no such thing as a temporary solution. I think he's right. Once it's there, the ability for you to make changes or refactor or do anything like that and really get the time to do this will really highly depend on how much your project is able to value quality. If maybe something needs to be done right now, again, quick and dirty, because we're running into a deadline. We've all done this, but what I like to do is at least already create a story or create an allocation of time and effort in the future to fix this, because we don't want this to be something that is established. If we are agreeing to doing this so that we meet, for example, the schedule that is foreseen, okay, but then we need to make sure that actually we already take this additional effort that we will need to do to clean this up later into account, so that we don't get pushed to the next deadline afterwards and just keep working on something that should have been temporary. So I think as an architect, you're trying to protect the usability and the quality, because both lead to adoption. And for me, I always see that quality is more something that likely IT values very, very much, because, well, they see the mess to maintain if it's not there. And the usability is something that business values a lot, because if it's not usable, users will not use it. Those shadow systems will pop up. And again, you will not have that option. But the same thing can be said for quality, because if some system needs, starts to break down or becomes unreliable in some way, then it will also lead to worse adoption. So I think there again, if you can balance these, if you can communicate these concerns sufficiently to both stakeholders, it's going to make sure that hopefully you're not that often in a situation that you have to do something quick and dirty. So from the business point of view, what they want here is really they want to view value from their investment. They are investing quite a bit of money usually into such a project. So let's make sure they have a short feedback loop. It doesn't mean that we have to do everything quickly, but it means that we have to make sure they are involved, that they see the progress, and that we make it very clear how this will benefit them and what is going to be in it for them, because that's in the end a very human thing. What's in it for me? Well, make this clear what value it will have, and make sure you keep them enticed. They see what's going on, they see the progress, and that they will get this return on investment. So in the end, they will have an efficient and adopted system. That is what they value a lot. They want to have this usability. From IT point of view, you want to have a robust solution system architecture through the best practices. They are set in place for a reason. But on the other hand, it has to be a usable system. So again, balancing the two. And then very importantly, we all want actually realistic timelines and expectations. Business wants this too. It's just a bit tricky to make sure that these expectations are set correctly, and that they know that something will happen at a certain time. And again, here, what I think is the best way to approach this is to be quite transparent and make sure that people know why something needs to happen in a certain way. Again, people care, but their perspectives differ. So make sure that you're speaking their language and that you're really making sure that they understand why something needs to give. And then the last one, you don't have to be the expert. You have to be the bridge, which is kind of what I've been trying to say all night. So very important in this one. I don't know is a valid response. You have no idea how often I say this phrase, because you don't know all the ins and outs. It's just impossible to do. you don't have, the time to do all of these things and be an expert in everything. That's just not feasible, especially at the rate that Salesforce acquires new companies and introduces new features. You don't have the time to be an expert in everything. So there will be a point that you don't know. And I think it's always better to just acknowledge that, and bring in someone who does. So if you know who to bring to the table at the right time in a project, this can be critical to the success. And that's why I kind of introduced this schematic, which I talked more about in a session I did for Cactus Force. I added the link in case you want to know a bit more. But it's all about, what do you need to know as an architect, and where do you bring in your team? And I think this is really, really important to keep in mind. You cannot do it all. You really have to be this bridge. You cannot have all the business knowledge. You cannot have all the IT knowledge. You have to make sure that you're just there, surrounded by the right people, and that you acknowledge and bring them in at the right time. But what is really important in this role is to be able to explain quite complex concepts sometimes to audiences who are not used to this, who don't really have this technical or business depth or background to understand the concept. So the layman audience, let's say. So make sure that you can explain why this particular process needs to be set up, why tax regulations need to be set up in this way, and why it's important, without necessarily going into all the ins and outs that are not relevant for the audience. And the other way around as well, make sure that you can understand why, or business understands why you need to invest time into really getting this trigger framework just right, and how this will help them in the end. They don't need to know all the ins and outs, but they do need to know the value. And I think if you take one thing away from my talk tonight, that's really it, is if you can, in a clear way, explain why something is important, from business to technical or the other way around, that is your differentiator as an architect on a project. That's really what's going to get that value and make sure that people progress in the right direction and have the same view and go in the same direction with the same perspectives or values in mind. So that was it. I hope it was interesting. Thank you again for having me, and I'm open to questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen so I can actually see you guys. And then any questions you have, feel free to fire them off.
Thank you so much, Lilith. It was amazing. I have a couple folks here from Capgemini, Brazil, that were like, cheering for you, and
Awesome.
send me message here on the chat saying pretty much, thanks for having this. So yes, the microphone is open. Anybody with any questions, any comments, feel free. This is your time. Come on, folks.
I see a question in the chat. Shall I address it
Oh
already?
yeah,
Carla?
sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I see from David that there's a DevOps. So I had a role RM. Well, RM is release management. I don't know if that helps a bit more. I can provide a bit more background on what is the release management process, but it's very, very broad, and likely not just one person fulfilling it, but it goes all the way from the technical setup, how is your Git set up, your Bitbucket pipelines, maybe all of the different quality assurance tooling that you have, peer code review, static code analysis, but also maybe that automated testing that I was talking about. But you also have this, the overarching program aspect of release management. If you have various teams, what is your release train? Is it aligned with other teams? Again, I was talking about dependencies. Maybe there are certain other teams also deploying in a particular train, and you need to align for some changes to make sure, again, you don't break anything because they might be interdependent. So sorry, my bad, David. So I didn't really mean a person. I meant more of a team on the RM side. Hope that clears it out.
Well, before we go, I want to give a shout out here to Christian Margarian, and he's from Denmark. He has a brand new architect group in there. So people, Christian, if you want to put on the chat the link for your architect group, maybe people here from US can join, can support people all over the world. I mean, right here for the Tampa Architect Group, I see just a couple people here. As I said, let me see. I know that I saw some people here before. Rich Belleville, he's the leader of the Tampa Admin Group. He's been around for a while. I saw earlier, I have seen here, Chris Valentin, hopes to see him becoming a CTA in the next few months because he's working very hard. So we don't have a lot of people, technically speaking, like a based in Tampa, but that that's the beauty of technology. We're doing this with people all over the world. We are planning at the end of October an architect day event here in Tampa. Okay, for those like Lilith that are CTAs, there is a CTA summit that took place back during Trailhead DX, and that was by invitation only, and you had to be a CTA. So for those that are not a CTA, I always say you don't need to be a CTA to be a good architect, but you need to be a good architect to be a CTA. So we are planning towards the end of October, maybe end of October, first week of November. We are planning an architect today. Okay, probably we're gonna do by invitation. And why by invitation? Well, this is about architect. It's not about being a developer or admin or marketing or nonprofit. It's about to be an architect. So we want to be very inclusive, but people really need to know where they stand on that. There's no registration. It's not like a dreaming event. You don't need to you can probably register to have a head count so that we can plan, but you don't need to pay registration. We don't need sponsors. There's no such a thing. We have already secured a company that has support the Tampa area often. It's the entire floor, it's the 11th floor for the company, and it's like a 360-degree view of a beautiful Tampa Bay. Rich Belleville have been there before several times. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. And they have small rooms for 10 people, big rooms for 60 to 70 people. Okay, so the idea is that probably people flying here on a Thursday night and have all day Friday with Salesforce people already. I spoke to Salesforce people. The senior director of our architecture relationships for Salesforce happens to be in Tampa. He's very excited about this, but we have to see if it's a go or no. So keep your eyes peeled. Thus can afford to fly to Tampa end of October. That will be good in case you live in a location that's already cooler. And you enjoy the Friday, the event, and then you have a Saturday and Sunday to do that as well. Back to you, Lilith, if you have any closing comments and if anybody else has any questions.
Yeah, I saw a question from Lance about the architect group I was referring to. So I think in the intro I mentioned SIMA. So SIMA, I can provide the link in the chat as well. It's a group where we have a lot of sessions on different topics, architect domains as well. So I will put a comment in the chat.
Good. I'm going to share again on the chat for people that probably is the first time. I put in the link here for the Tampa, for the architect group. And the next event is exactly 2 weeks from today. Normally you will have events once a month, but the demand has been so big that we're doing every 2 weeks. And you probably want to run out of speakers, but that's what happened when you have a demand. So the next event is going to be on August the 3rd, exactly the same time. It's going to be a very, very unique event. It's called a Salesforce Industries Omni Studio. Just 2 or 3 CTAs around the world that I know that specialize on that. And that's a big, big, big market right now for Salesforce industry. So if you have a chance, go in there, register right now, and make sure that we have some quorum going to support her. The person doing, she's from India, and she's been doing this from Singapore. So I don't even know what time it's going to be for her, but in advance, I want to say thank you for her, because it's going to be a great event. Other than that, Lilith, any
Carlos?
final Oh, Christian, go ahead, Christian. Thank you.
I have a question. Thanks a lot for the shout out, Carlos, and thanks Lilith for taking the time and sharing this awesome your awesome perspectives. I'm a big fan. I have a question to you. So many of the things you suggest and the perspectives you provide take quite a lot of guts and stamina and being assertive and so forth. What would be your best advice for architects who are aspiring architects or just starting out? How have you dealt with it? Could you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a really, really good question. So thanks so much for asking it, because actually this was something that I struggled with quite a bit throughout my journey. So I grow quite quickly, which means that I don't always, or didn't always feel like, okay, I'm talking to these people who have so many years of experience. Why would they listen to me, right? But what really empowered me to actually speak up is starting small and starting from the insights that I was gathering on this journey to CTA. So for example, where you're going to the prereqs, you're learning a lot about large data volumes, you're learning a lot about sharing and visibility. So you're learning all these new domains where you're getting insights, where you can actually use this to identify risks. So Rome wasn't built in a day, and my confidence definitely was neither. So this is something that just some small steps. And if one of the things that you're a bit insecure about is just talking and speaking up, well, I don't have to tell you, you have your architect groups. I'm sure you're fine with those things. But for anyone who might be insecure, is actually just take those opportunities to speak in these groups, whether it be architect, user, developer, whatever works for you. But practice there, because in the end, that's how you get better at it. I hope that's a bit of a useful answer.
Very, very. Thanks a lot.
Chris, Valentin,
Someone's
you're on
muted.
mute. Yeah, Chris, you're on mute. Still on mute. Technology is beautiful.
Hello?
Thank you. Yeah, now we can hear you now.
Now I can't hear you. There it is. Okay. I think they got this. Got so many different these messaging systems. So great, very great, very important topic. Lilith, always appreciate hearing from you, learning from you. Wanted to say, do you find that this is you're putting it toward architects, but is this just an architect role? Is this some that these points, some that you found that other people in the team can support you do?
So definitely, I think, you can do them all, right? So for example, when it comes to the risks, you're not the expert on all of the elements. So there definitely are things that you can do alone. You just can't, and you need a team to work with you. And I think actually on a lot of these points are actually those points that you cannot do alone. You don't know the business processes enough to make sure that, you can assess whether something is user-friendly or usable. So it's always going to be, again, as you actually already pointed out, going to be a collaboration between you and your team. So the only thing that I would say there is make sure that you nurture also that environment that people know that they can, speak up. And again, I think it will help also in people who might need a bit more confidence to actually take these actions, like Christian was pointing out, that they feel like, yes, they can come to you with any concerns that they have. I always love it when I go to a technical team and I explain this is how I would solve it, and they're like, I don't know. Did you think about this or that? That's, if you have, that's great. It means that you're looking in the right direction. If you haven't, that's also great, because you're thinking about this now before it's being implemented. So that culture of welcoming feedback is really, really important in getting this stuff done.
Yeah. So I want to add, I've had projects, I think like everybody, that have gone better than expected, not as well as expected, and as expected, right? And I would say a lot of these items that you pointed out, they're the type of items like if you don't mention a risk and you fail because you didn't mention a risk, like that's what you kind of look at. What do I need courage to say this? Well, if I don't, and it fails about this thing that I saw coming, how are you going to feel then? Right? And kind of weigh those two things. Which one's going to stink more? At least that's the way I've looked at it. And kind of went, oh, do I want to say something here to this CIO that this is his idea, but I know it's wrong. Right? But if I'd rather say it now and be right than, and they're going to forget if you're wrong, right? But then not say anything at all, and it cause issues down the road.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about how you bring it to, right? You don't have to be very almost aggressive in your, you can be like, bring it in a softer way to just address like, okay, I think it's a valid point. However, what do we do about this part? Because I think it could be a risk.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, because how people hear things makes a big difference.
Yeah, exactly.
Tying into that, one of the things I've always told my clients is it's really simple. My job is to tell you roughly how much and roughly when it'll be done. Your job is to judge the value.
Yeah.
So I had a client that wanted to spend a lot of money to do what I thought was the complete stupidest, dumbest friggin' thing ever. I said, normally I would not, say something, but you're spending a lot of money for something that I think is stupid. They go, just do it. And I implemented it. And then 2 months later, they said, thank you very much. We got 6X off of what we paid you just in donations. It was for a nonprofit. So, as Lilith mentioned before, you don't know everything, and you probably don't know the business as well as they know the business. So it is a fine line by sitting there saying you're stupid for doing this. And, it's a juggling act.
Yeah. But if you lost money on that, then you would have been right. And right?
No, I made money. That's their call. It's their money. If they want to go to the bathroom and wipe their butts with $100 bills, that's fine. Okay. Like I said, I never understand what, I'm not running their business. So I can never know the value.
No, it's true. But I think it's a fair point to just raise it instead, even though in the end it's their decision, because
Yes.
a lot of this it's good to raise it still, just to make sure that, they can go in with a full view on what do you think is a risk or why you would or would not propose that they actually do this. And it could be that you're wrong, like David pointed out, but it could be that, just maybe they reconsider and you save them a lot of money.
Yep. It's all about pointing it out.
Exactly. Yeah.
And just in the context of this conversation now, then, does that not make a consultant different than a ticket taker that just does what you say because you're doing these 7 points that you're coming out that you mentioned here? That, like, I'm consulting you, I'm telling you about your risk, I want you to consider all your options, all those points that you mentioned. That's what the consultant does versus a company that just comes in and does the exact thing on the ticket that you said to do.
Exactly. It's again about transparency and building trust, right? So maybe they will go with the ticketing company for a few months, maybe even a year or two. But in the end, they will realize, okay, that we're building kind of monsters here, and it's not going to work in the long term. So I think always I like to have a long-term relationship with any customer that I have, because I think that's more valuable than now just pushing a lot of development on them, and in the end, them paying a lot of money for something that they won't use. Or even worse, that's, I think, one of the worst nightmares or in my head is just another person going into the system and seeing what kind of monster someone built just because they were blindly following business instructions. I don't want to have my name associated with those kind of monsters. So yeah.
Okay, folks. Anything else? Is almost breakfast time for Lilith and Christian. Okay. If it's nothing else, I want to say it again. Thank you for Lilith for being this late. Thanks for everybody that attended. And the recording will be available on the YouTube channel, on the group, on the Trailblazer community, on the group, on the Trailhead community, and on the Twitter for the for the group. So looking forward to see you folks again in 2 weeks, and keep the questions, keeping getting involved and spreading the word in there. All right.
Thanks, Carlos.
Take care.
Great session.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Carlos. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice sleep. Lilith.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.